Tonight on Nova, we continue a major series unlocking the mysteries of science in China. It's a tale of triumph, defeat, and the struggle to regain past glory. Journey deep inside these ancient walls in search of the genius that was China. This week, in the 19th century, Western powers dominated a weakened and divided China, while the Japanese raced to master European science and the technology of war. Their success created the threat from Japan.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying health care products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
The waterfront at Shanghai, the famous Bund. Where Chinese families now promenade, Europeans once ruled, with Chinese second-class citizens in their own land. Shanghai was the greatest of the treaty ports, a western enclave tacked on to the margin of the ancient Chinese civilization. Shanghai in the late 19th century was wealthy, modern, cosmopolitan, but its tall buildings were symbols of European domination over the once proud Chinese empire. Throughout the 19th century, China was battered by the military and economic power built on Western science. Yet despite decades of effort, China remained unable to defend itself against the machines and men of the West. Not so the Japanese. By the middle of the 20th century, Japanese military might dominated the Far East. For centuries, cultural disciples of China, when the power of European technology confronted Asia a century before, the Japanese response to the threat was so successful that in the Second World War, the Japanese challenged not just China, but the Western nations as well. So what was the secret of Japan's ability to absorb the knowledge of the West? And what were the consequences of China's failure to bend to the winds of change? The story begins with the establishment of the treaty ports after the Opium War of 1839 to 42. In the Treaty of Nanjing, the Chinese agreed that the Europeans could establish trading bases in which Western laws, not Chinese, would rule. The first of the unequal treaties Asian powers were forced to accept. Beginning with the first 5 treaty ports, these Western-controlled cities formed a kind of necklace along the coast. And throughout the 19th century, the European powers sought to extend their influence from these footholds into China. Yet despite the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Nanjing, Outside the treaty port areas, the vast Chinese interior remained apparently untouched by the foreign presence on the coast. But by the middle of the 19th century, the calm of rural China was to be broken. The West's opium, missionary activity, overpopulation, natural disasters all racked rural life, leading eventually to open revolt. This Chinese film recalls the most serious uprising, the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from the early 1850s to 1865. The Taiping Rebellion was based on a cloudy mixture of Christianity and some ancient Chinese doctrine. It was, however, a direct challenge to the power of the emperor and to the philosophy of Confucianism that sustained him. The revolution was led by Hung Shu-chuan, a failed scholar who had read a Western missionary pamphlet and in a vision concluded that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Hung and his followers dominated much of central China for over 10 years, and in the war to suppress his revolt, 20 million Chinese died. And though the imperial government did win in the end, it did so at a cost of weakening its own central power. Regional commanders like Li Hongjiang helped defeat the Taipings, and the experience of battle caused Li to become one of the leaders in the drive to adopt Western military technology. The Chinese began to buy some modern weaponry, though at first it was a rather haphazard effort. The British and French exploited China's weakness, attacking Chinese forts in 1856 and extracting new concessions from Beijing. In defeat, China's leaders divided into two opposing factions.
The conservatives in the Qing court said there was nothing wrong with Chinese civilization. All we needed was to strengthen our resolve, our faith in ourselves, our moral virtues, and that moral strength and spiritual strength will provide the answer to all these foreigners. We need a few more guns, but essentially it's our own confidence in our values that will save us. The reformers were a little bit more practical and said that the guns are actually more important than that. We still need the guns. Then we need to learn how to make them, to have properly trained technologists, trained by the Westerners to come and train a new generation of experts in military technology.
Li Hongjiang and other reformers in the provinces launched what was called the self-strengthening movement. Their efforts centered on developing military technology, and in Shanghai in 1868, they even built China's first steam-powered warship. But though the self-strengtheners continued to press for change, they were still imperial bureaucrats, and the change they sought was always constrained by the limits that the Chinese court would tolerate.
It was in that context that this Ti and Yung principle was brought in to try and find a way of putting in a nutshell what the problem was, that we will not destroy Chinese civilization. We'll use Chinese civilization as the essence. But we will simply adapt certain techniques in order to strengthen Chinese civilization without in any way affecting the heart of Chinese civilization. And then the Ti-Yung principle came in. Ti being the Chinese essence, cultural civilization as essence, and the Yung being the technology from the West, which could be applied for Chinese purposes in order to restore and strengthen Chinese civilization.
China's struggle to preserve its sovereignty was closely watched by Japan, still cloaked in isolation. In In Japan, power lay in the hands of feudal lords, or daimyo. Japan's political system had been set in place by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who in 1603 unified the country and was declared shogun, or military dictator. The Tokugawas closed off Japan for 250 years, and the hereditary samurai warriors became the elite ruling class. But after the Opium War, the isolated power of both shogun and samurai were to be fundamentally challenged. In 1853, these black ships of the United States Navy, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into Tokyo Bay. Perry's orders were to negotiate a treaty with Japan, securing trade rights and establishing treaty ports. The Japanese, with the memory of China's collapse searingly fresh in their minds, saw no choice but to comply. Perry's face was a startling vision to Japan's woodblock artists, and the gifts he brought made quite an impression as well. Perry gave his Japanese hosts a miniature railway, new cannon, and this telegraph. As his official report noted, though in their later history a Pacific people, the Japanese are fond of military display and seem particularly desirous of scrutinizing all the warlike appointments which made their visitors so formidable. But well before Perry arrived on the scene, China's defeats had impressed some Japanese leaders with the need to learn from the West. This European-style factory was established in southern Japan by a remarkable daimyo named Nariakira. Nariakira sent emissaries overseas to purchase such novel devices as this carding machine for spinning cotton from Platt Brothers in the north of England. Nariakira imported engineers along with the machines to teach him how to manage the new technology. And this was all part of a much older Japanese tradition.
Since around the 6th century, Japanese leaders sent young scholars to China, which was regarded as the center of civilization at the time, and invited Chinese scholars and technicians to Japan to learn from them. So when Japanese leaders started learning from Western countries, they were not doing anything particularly new. In fact, in contrast to Chinese leaders who defined their land as the center of the universe, Japanese leaders consistently regarded their country as being peripheral to the center of civilization. And as a consequence, they were pretty much comfortable with the idea of importing Western technology and Western institutions to Japanese society.
Nariakira even designed a flag, the rising sun of Japan. Eventually, in 1868, pressure from southern daimyo and samurai led to revolution. The rebel forces rallied round the Meiji Emperor, transforming a powerless symbol into a Western-style constitutional monarch. The shogun's traditional troops were no match for rebel forces organized along Western lines. The shogun was forced to abdicate, and the hereditary power structure that had ruled Japan for centuries was swept aside. At treaty ports like Yokohama, the Japanese had begun to encounter the world economy, and the new Meiji government embarked on a road of radical reform and westernization. The Japanese, unified under the central control of the new regime, shared a common goal: to grasp the secrets of Western might in order to resist the further incursions of the West. By contrast, no such revolution swept through the Forbidden City. In China, more fragmented than ever after the Taiping Rebellion, conservatives and reformers remained at cross purposes. The reformers continued to adapt Western inventions to Chinese goals. They set up government-owned enterprises to funnel new technology into China. One of these was the Merchant Steam Navigation Company, created to handle trade on China's vast waterways. It was established with the support of Li Hongjiang, now one of the highest-ranking reformers among government officials. The reformers undertook several other projects: arsenals to build Western weapons, cotton mills, shipyards, paper mills, and coal mines. But the fate of the Steamship Navigation Company was typical of these experiments, as it soon fell afoul of the bureaucratic politics.
During the self-strengthening movement, people like Li Hongjiang were pretty imaginative about trying to adapt some of the modern techniques of trading and entrepreneurial efforts to China's needs. And the creation of a number of companies, one of the most famous, of course, is the Steam Navigation Company, I think illustrates how capable they were of using new techniques for their purposes. But the problem was that they had to do it in the context of opposition by conservative forces within the court. And therefore, they had to make concessions as to how these enterprises should be run. As the example of Steam Navigation Company shows, one can see why the traditional methods of interfering in the business, drawing out the capital, when in fact what should have been done was reinvesting the capital in further development, that part of it is a philosophical approach towards economics which hadn't penetrated in the minds of these Confucian bureaucrats who were managing. The merchants understood that, but they didn't have the last say in decision-making.
Some merchants grew very wealthy indeed, but unlike their Japanese counterparts, they could not dramatically alter the direction of the Chinese economy. Instead, the European firms of the treaty ports came to dominate China's industrial scene. Despite the self-strengthening effort, by the late 19th century, most of China's modern factories were in European hands. Even such traditional occupations as cotton and silk spinning were increasingly European-owned. The factories were a stronghold of unbridled capitalism, with miserable working conditions and the common use of child labor. Those Chinese in management positions had little contact with technology. They were primarily middlemen who organized resources and labor for the European owners of the factories. The Chinese were no longer masters of their own destiny. The failure of the Chinese to gain ownership of the tools of production created by the Industrial Revolution was to have devastating consequences. This blast furnace was one of the key inventions of the 19th century. In the 1850s, an Englishman named Henry Bessemer had introduced his new method for producing steel, in which hot air was blown through holes in the bottom of a giant furnace, producing the heat required to transform molten iron into steel. The process took only a fraction of the time and money required by traditional methods. Cheap steel had a revolutionary impact throughout the world. Railways and steamships connected the industrial marketplaces of Europe to the far-flung ends of colonial empires. The They opened up the vast resources of Russia in the east and of America's Wild West.
The railroad was particularly useful to imperialism because it allowed the Western powers to move into the interiors of the vast continents, into Asia, into Latin America, into Africa, into countries like India and Australia. Where before there had been merely trading posts, now there were plantations, there were mines and factories owned and controlled by Westerners. And it was this that disturbed the existing power structures in those countries. So now we have China on the outer edge of all this, the receiving end, well aware of the commanding power of Western technology. And so, when in 1876, a group of commercial interests, headed by Jardine Matheson, a British firm, indeed erected an unauthorized railroad between Shanghai and Wusong, it did disturb local interests, and the local authorities were worried. The result of all this was that the Chinese government bought up the whole railway project. And now what did they do? Did they run that railway line? No. Lock, stock, and barrel, the whole thing was dismantled.
That railway was shipped in pieces to the remote island of Taiwan and then allowed to rust to bits. The Chinese resistance to such an obviously useful device seemed odd, even perverse to Europeans anxious to get on with their business. But from the Chinese perspective, it was the only prudent decision. The Chinese believed that the shape of the land itself has spiritual properties, and the railways both disturbed this natural balance of the land and upset traditional patterns of life. The Chinese also knew that if they allowed the British to build a railway, other European powers would demand similar rights. But the Chinese were unable to resist Western pressure for long. And when the railways began to spread, the lines were held in foreign hands.
Now in Japan, with a strong Meiji government, the political encroachment of the West has been far less than in China, and the railways proceeded very quickly. The first line was opened in 1872. It was a line between Tokyo and Yokohama. 20,000 spectators witnessed the emperor and his retinue boarding the train. Here was a symbol of the old Japan alighting onto the new Western technology. By the 1880s, most of the engineering work and the surveying done on the new lines was completely done by the Japanese. Japanese railroads were in the hands of the Japanese people.
This was no accident, as the Meiji government continued to press forward aggressively in its effort to learn from the West. In the latter half of the 19th century, the European powers displayed their latest technology at the great exhibitions of the day. The Japanese were among the most eager spectators, observing closely the speed with which technology was changing. No sooner did Krupps of Germany exhibit their latest massive cannon than Armstrongs of Britain set out to make a bigger one. The Japanese delegation soon understood that the Chinese self-strengthening movement was on the wrong track. Just buying machines that would swiftly be obsolete was a futile effort. To keep up with the West, the Japanese concluded they would have to import the entire package, the social, economic, and educational institutions that fostered Western science. One young samurai who played a major role in this process was Fukazawa Yukiichi. Fukazawa helped design the educational system in Japan, and in 1858 he founded Keio University, an American-style college in Tokyo. This is the speaking hall or debating room that Fukazawa built to nurture the essential spirit of contention and argument that he observed in the West. Fukasawa's grandson, Dr. Kiyoka, spent his career here at Keio.
Fukasawa was trying to bring in a new idea in the education in Japan. He found that Japan lacked what he called the spirit of science. He used the words, the spirit of number and reason. And that's what he was trying to teach his pupils.
Fukasawa wrote one of the first books that sought to expose the arcane mysteries of the West to the Japanese public. His book, Things Western, was one of the most popular titles sold in Meiji Japan. Fukasawa illustrated it himself, and he displayed meticulous attention to the minutiae of Western life. The book even included a description of a chamber pot, which some Japanese visitors to the West mistook for a pillow. In Japan, you rest your head on a hard porcelain block.
It sold very well, almost like wildfire. Something like 100,000 copies in a few years' time. And even now, you can read it with interest.
But importing the institutions of a foreign culture proved to be more difficult than the Meiji reformers hoped, even for the Japanese. One of the first projects launched by the new Meiji government was the construction of this silk spinning factory in 1872. European silk production had been devastated by a silkworm blight, providing the Japanese with the opportunity to develop an export industry. French engineers were hired to build the government's silk spinning complex, and the two cultures clashed. The French wanted to build a factory out of brick, like the ones back home, while the Japanese favored wood, more flexible in the face of earthquakes. And this compromise was the result. A traditional wood frame building filled in with brick to make it look like a European factory. More seriously, the factory proved inefficient, losing money hand over fist, just like a number of Chinese public enterprises. But the Japanese responded to their setbacks very differently from the Chinese. When the government businesses ran into trouble, this man, Shibusawa Eiichi, came up with a solution that would make them pay. The young samurai became a respected banker. And as a member of the Ministry of Finance, Shibusawa concluded that such firms ought to be converted to private companies.
Shibusawa himself being a samurai, had resolved the problem by recognizing the managerial capabilities of this disenfranchised or unemployed class, if you want. He also recognized the importance of abolishing the notion of class, and that they would become equals with workers and with government officials as a new breed of entrepreneurs. But to do that, it was important to find a motive, because the samurai who lived by the code of Bushido believed that gentlemen did not pursue gain. That the pursuit of gain was not an honorable profession.
The Meiji government had abolished hereditary samurai status, and the military function of the samurai had been taken over by a conscript army, which left thousands of the once elite samurai out of work. Japanese life was changing, and it seemed as if the samurai were out of place in society as well. Shibusawa gave the samurai a role. He helped found this, Japan's first commercial bank, supported by the wealthy merchant family of Mitsui. The Mitsui Bank financed hundreds of new joint stock companies to be managed by both merchants and samurai. The pursuit of profit, Shibusawa argued, was as essential for building a strong nation as the army. As economic soldiers, the samurai's new function would be to develop Japan's industrial muscle. The government shipyard at Nagasaki went to the samurai Iwasaki Yataro, founder of Mitsubishi.
The new joint stock company was perceived basically as an institution for assimilating, transferring, adapting Western technology. This was one of the fundamental purposes of this new organization. So it was organized, it was established and conceived as a social institution for the purposes of managing rapid technological change in order to catch up.
The Japanese, with their radical Meiji government, were able to wipe the slate clean and start again. With their relative freedom of action, the new Japanese companies immediately set out to adapt Western technology to develop industries appropriate to Japan's own economy.
Here is a very important adaptation of that technology to Japan. This is an invention of such machines by Sakichi Toyota in the late 19th century. This was designed for weaving kimono cloth. Kimono cloth is narrow, so the machine could be small in size. Also, Sakichi used wood in frame or in other various parts. So iron was too expensive, so expensive. So by using wood, Sakichi succeeded in reducing production costs of power loom.
The Toyota innovations were so successful that within 50 years of first importing Platt Brothers machinery, Toyota was selling patent rights for mechanical looms back to the British.
The differences between the situation in Japan and China at the time are striking. First, in Japan, you had a relatively strong central government with a sense of purpose, a rapid catch-up, an obsession to catch up with the West and to learn from the West, therefore, as a means of catching up. In China, you neither had a strong central government or a feeling that it was necessary to learn from the West in order to defend China or against the West. This recognition really never came home quite as acutely as it did here. So these two differences of course, were critical. And so it was impossible in China to develop the kind of cooperation that you had in Japan between the government and the new business community. These companies were established close relationships with foreign companies, with foreign firms that could provide the technology needed in Japan. The technology transferred is still evident. You go to the Toshiba headquarters or their old buildings in Kawasaki, you find licenses signed in the hands of Thomas A. Edison for the production of electric lamps in Japan.
The archetype of the new breed of scientist-inventor, Thomas Edison, was a hero in Japan, just as he was in the United States. Edison's practical application of electricity was the culmination of the late 19th century technological revolution. And his flickering bulbs astounded the world in 1880 when his Edison Electric Company illuminated the streets of New York. 7 years later, the Tokyo Electric Company followed suit, halfway around the globe. Within 3 decades of Perry's arrival off Tokyo Bay, the contrast between Japan's response to the West and China's could not have been more stark. In the interest of matching Western power, Japan was prepared to copy the West down to the last detail. For the Japanese, foreign fashion, foreign institutions, and above all, foreign ideas were all part of the desperate race to catch up with the West. One of the most influential ideas was a bastardization of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. The notion of social Darwinism held that some nations, like some species, were better fitted for survival than others, an idea that Darwin himself rejected, but that struck a chord in Japan.
Japanese leaders became very much conscious of Japan's location in the international ladder of civilizations, so to speak, in which, in their perceptions, Western societies were placed at the top rungs, Japan somewhere in the middle, and Asian societies at the bottom. In this process, cultural leaders of Japan invented an ideological slogan, Datsuwa Nyuo, meaning literally de-Asianize and Europeanize Japan. In fact, Japan not only imitated Western technology and Western institutions, but also emulated Western imperialism as well.
The survival of the fittest was to be determined by those who had best mastered Western technology, especially the technology of war. The confrontation between China and Japan in August 1894 over control of Korea left no doubt which nation was ahead. Japan's fleet could maneuver at twice the speed of China's, and within hours the Chinese had lost 4 ships and 1,000 officers and men. On land, the Japanese captured forts along China's coast and inflicted a further defeat, humiliating though hardly surprising. This marble boat was built at great expense for the Chinese Empress. The funds were diverted from self-strengthening, while the Chinese still mustered troops of nomad bowmen. And though the Chinese did possess a few modern weapons, their troops remained desperately under-equipped and unprepared. Their defeat in 1895 exposed how far China had fallen behind. On surrendering, the Chinese were forced to pay an indemnity worth $150 million, and the Japanese gained territorial rights within China, similar to those of the European powers. But even after that humiliating defeat, the powerful Empress Dowager, mother of the reigning emperor, and conservative court officials remained adamantly opposed to change. And yet China's defeat opened the door for one last push for reform from within. This film offers a fictional account.
应该怎么办？依臣之见，第一，要除旧，而后才可布新，难呐。第二，依据日本明治维新的经验，皇上要亲任海陆军大元帅，以免除后顾之忧。第三，对敢于阻挠新政的人严惩不贷，必要时也要杀人。 使彼等触目惊心，不敢再阻挠新政。
The emperor backed the reformers, and for 100 days, traditional China stood on the threshold of change. Edicts issued in the emperor's name would have restructured the bureaucracy, the military, and the educational systems, but none were ever implemented. The reformers held power only within the imperial palace itself, and that not for very long. Conservative officials and the Empress Dowager herself launched a counter-coup, quashed the reforms, and executed many of the reformers. The emperor was placed under house arrest, and the Empress Dowager ruled.
That really killed off the reformist spirit for quite a while. The Boxer Rebellion which followed was in a way an expression of the frustration of almost everybody in China, that something was needed, something had been attempted, nothing was coming out of it. And that expression took the form of this violent outburst against foreigners, which ended up, of course, with China further humiliated.
The rebels, called Boxers for their belief that mastery of martial arts would render them invulnerable to bullets, attacked the foreigners they blamed for China's ills, and the foreign powers retaliated. The international force mustered to relieve the besieged foreign quarter in Beijing included Japanese troops, and the Japanese took their role in the fighting as a symbol of their new status. The Japanese assumed that they had won the right to membership in the Imperialists Club. In reality, they were blackballed. The cartoonist Georges Bigot mocked the racism and arrogance of European imperialists. Together, the Western powers carved up China for their own economic benefit, extending railway concessions and defining spheres of influence. In this game, there was no room for new players. The Japanese were forced to withdraw from China with no new territorial concessions, fobbed off by their European allies with only their share of the cash indemnity that China was forced to pay. That indemnity, however, was no small thing. Japan's share came to $24 million, more than 1% of Japan's national income in 1900. And with it, the Japanese built this massive iron and steel works at Yawata, economic growth paid for by money China could have used to develop its own industry. Instead, Japan continued to race ahead as both an industrial and a military power. Japanese steelmakers developed close ties with Krupps of Germany, and from Krupps they got not just basic knowledge of steel manufacturing, but a close look at the technology of modern weapons. Over the next several years, the Japanese relationship with Krupps deepened. Here, a delegation is shown visiting the Krupps firing range to witness a demonstration of the latest German military hardware. Japan's mastery of the techniques of modern war was amply proved in 1904. The Illustrated London News graphically detailed the conflict between Japan and the Russian Empire. At stake was control of Manchuria, northeastern China. The Illustrated News praised the Japanese for their diligent pursuit of Western civilization, but no one really believed that they could win. Then, in 1905, the unthinkable happened. At the naval battle at Tsushima Straits, the Imperial Japanese Navy devastated the Russian fleet. Russia was forced to abandon its position in Manchuria, and Japan emerged as the dominant Asian power. The Japanese victory had enormous significance for the Chinese. The central myth of the invincible European sank with the Russian fleet, and the Chinese turned to the Japanese example. They established new educational institutions like Beijing University, and in 1906 the imperial government abolished the examination system, which for almost 1,500 years had selected government officials on the basis of their knowledge of Confucian classics. A Japanese-style Ministry of Education was established, but the reform was too little, too late. Dr. Sun Yat-sen led 10 attempts to overthrow the imperial government before victory came in 1911. The last emperor, the infant Puyi, abdicated in 1912. For the nationalist Sun, China now had the chance to reclaim its former glory.
The acceptance of foreign ideas to the point when it becomes part of your own understanding of your own new worldview, I think is a very difficult thing for any civilization anyway. One of the most remarkable things about the 1911 revolution was that I think Sun Yat-sen was probably the first Chinese to thoroughly understand or absorb a set of Western ideas. He still failed to communicate his particular excitement to the rest of the Chinese population. It took a long, long time. But that's an example of how difficult it is. And he did it because he was educated abroad, lived so many years outside of China that he could do it. He became part of himself. He managed to internalize a number of Western values. But for most other Chinese intellectuals, the more intellectual they were, the better educated they were, the harder it was.
Sun was unable to unite China's competing factions, and he resigned as provisional president in 1912. China soon broke into warring fiefdoms, with local warlords controlling their territory by strength of arms. The larger conflict of World War I mostly passed China by, though China did side with the victorious Allies. So when the Allies proposed handing over the German concessions in China to the Japanese at the Versailles Conference, Chinese students were enraged. On May 4th, 1919, students in Beijing marched in protest. The Japanese encroachments highlighted China's weakness, and the students called for both a boycott of Japanese goods and the transformation of Chinese culture with science and democracy. The May 4th movement, as it became known, galvanized Chinese opinion. And during the 20s, the economy, as well as Chinese culture, altered quickly. In the boom atmosphere, heavy industry began to grow. Treaty port industrialists did well. But for the first time, so did a small yet growing Chinese entrepreneurial class. But some facts of Chinese life stayed the same. And for the vast majority of the Chinese people still living on the land, great poverty remained common. Conditions grew worse throughout the 20s, which helped to swell the recruiting of China's newest political movement. In the late 20s and 30s, the Communist Party, which had emerged from the May 4th movement, began to organize rural areas in a program of revolutionary change. What became the Great Depression around the world struck Japan as well.
The depression threw millions of workers out of work, and the ultra-nationalist propagandists attributed the declining economic and social conditions to Western imperialism and Western influence over Japan, with the justification for defending Asia against the yoke of Western imperialism. The Japanese military, which took over the government and demolished democratic domestic institutions, went into the Asian continent with an attempt to colonize the entire continent. So the political pendulum, so to speak, swung from the westernization of Japan to the Japanization of Asia.
This became the pretext for Japan's occupation of Manchuria in 1931. The Chinese put up some resistance, but were again unable to stem the Japanese advance. With few natural resources in the home islands, Manchuria became a strategic reserve of coal, oil, and iron, all necessary for the growth of Japan's military and industrial complex. With the influx of resources from its newly conquered territories, Japan's economy rebounded swiftly through the middle 30s. Tokyo became a modern metropolis, at once clearly both Japanese and new. A big city by any measure. But while Western powers had once praised Japan for its imitation of foreign ways, now Japan's expansion into Asia aroused fear and opposition.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East.
In 1933, at the League of Nations, Japan was censured for its occupation of Manchuria. This led Foreign Minister Matsuoka to make a bitter attack on the West for denying Japan access to their colonial markets. Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and set out to conquer the markets of Asia and the Pacific by more direct means. The Japanese increased the pressure on China until in 1937, from their bases in Manchuria, they launched a full-scale invasion. For the third time in less than 50 years, the armed forces of Japan and China were locked in open combat. Once again, the technology and arms of the Japanese were far superior to anything the Chinese could muster. By 1941, the imperial forces of Japan challenged not just China, but the European powers and the United States for domination of East Asia and the Pacific. From the moment Matthew Perry arrived off Tokyo Bay, the Japanese had consciously set out to build a militarily strong nation, one capable of imposing its will upon its surroundings. They succeeded. But by the war's end, these images of triumph, Western troops surrendering to their Japanese conquerors, were to prove a bitter memory. Both Japan and China would be left in ruins by the advances of science and technology that made the Second World War the most destructive in human history. Next time on Nova, after the Second World War, China set out to reclaim its former glory. China's new communist leaders sought to marry the best of Western science with their own ideological passion.
Most of the Chinese, they don't care about ideology. They're driven by the opportunities to improve their own lives, to test new freedoms, to try out new styles, to find new kinds of technology, to learn more about the outside world, and that has very little to do with ideology.
China tried to adopt Western methods without embracing Western ideas, producing a predictable clash. In the conclusion of The Genius That Was China, Nova asks, will the dragon rise again?
Tomorrow at this time, watch Smithsonian World as we examine the evolution of mankind, not only by usual scientific means, but also by way of the touchstones of art and literature. Tales of the Human Dawn, tomorrow at 8 on Smithsonian World. Stay with us now. Frontlines next with a report on Poland's fledgling democracy and her economic woes. Poland, the morning after, next at 9. Funding for Nova is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for Nova is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this
Alessandro Scarlatti. Morning Pro Musica is a program heard every day from 7 till noon, thanks to the generosity